All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Free Kiwis. Today, we're delighted to have with us Te Maire Tau, who is professor at the University of Canterbury. And he also holds the title of Pou Whakarae of the Ngāi Tahu Centre. Can you just explain maybe what that is and what your relationship is with the Ngāi Tahu Centre and also with Ngāi Tahu? Because we also have some international listeners. So can you just maybe unpack that and say what Ngāi Tahu is and what your role is?
So the position represents the treaty office for the university, and our job is to give clear views on what the treaty means within the university. We remove those old terms of Vice-Chancellor Māori, those types of things. They never really fitted well. So the hapu that I head in a customary sense in Christchurch is the tribe that has authority in Christchurch with the University of Canterbury. And that's what I represent in the university, and we engage with the Vice-Chancellor directly.
All right, so I'm interested that you use the word hapu there. So you're describing Ngāi Tahu as a hapu rather than an iwi?
Oh, it's a Ngāi Tahu is an iwi, which is a tribe, but within our charter, the sub-tribes or the hapu have authority for their particular regions, so that's the way the tribe works.
I see.
So this is you're representing the particular Christchurch hapu in the university, yeah.
Okay, so one of the things we wanted to talk to you about is tauranga Māori, because as our listeners will know, there was a big debate about this after 7 professors in Auckland wrote a letter to the Listener magazine suggesting that although tauranga Māori can play an important role in many spheres of New Zealand life, it's not the same as science when it comes to gaining sort of empirically verifiable truths about the world. So I just wanted to get your take on this because you've written extensively about tauranga Māori. So yeah, I'll just open with this very broad question. What is tauranga Māori and what's its relationship with science?
Well, it's knowledge. So just to posit that question, there's all types of knowledge systems. There's economic, political knowledge, whatever you want to call it, right? And then there's science, which is a particular field of knowledge that's important. The tribe has its knowledge system, but really what you have to, let's start with the 7 professors. Okay.
Yeah, sure.
You've got the 7 professors, you had their view. I guess one of the positions that we've taken within the tribe is they're hardly of the capacity to assess Māori knowledge systems because their criticism is based on a whole bunch of assumptions. And they're hardly experts in that area. Having said that, so they're on one end of the spectrum. On the other end, you had that Royal Society paper where it used what they called Mātauranga Māori to make the argument that we were in the Antarctic waters.
Right.
You know, and they used oral traditions to support that. Now, that group were on the other end of the spectrum. They were hardly experts in oral traditions, and really after we wrote our paper in response, they'd really miscalculated the traditions. How do I put it? You usually find someone in the Middle East who's found something on a mountain, you know, some wooden plank on a mountain, and that's proof of Noah's Ark.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's really what was done here, where scientists who had no skill in the knowledge systems and they'd really misinterpreted the original text had used it for their own political ends.
That seems to me to be quite a big issue in all of this is political barrow pushing. And I mean, I'm certainly no expert in tauranga Māori either, but I'd like to probe something with you because you are, about how knowledge is actually tested in tauranga Māori, and how it's tested in science, and whether there is a really substantial difference there. One of the things that I think about in this regard is the emergence of science in Eurasia. You know, sometime during the past 500 years, you can have an argument or a debate about exactly what constitutes science and when it came into being in a modern sense. But one thing that seems to me really important in all of it is the kind of Western dualist view of the universe. And the reason I say that is because, of course, you know, we know Galileo was persecuted by the Catholic Church for espousing, his evidence-based view that the Earth was not at the centre of the universe, that it revolved around the sun. But over the few hundred years following that, because European thinking had changed and the importance of religion declined somewhat and the authority of the church declined with it, by the time we got to Charles Darwin talking about evolution, he didn't have so much of a problem. He wasn't, the church was not able to threaten him, even though they didn't like what he had to say. So it seems to me possibly one thing about science that allowed it to thrive is the decline of religious authority. Now, in Māori culture, and, correct my ignorance, please, it seems to me that there's less of a separation between between spiritual and material understandings. Is that starting point of my thinking more or less correct?
Oh, look, I can understand why you think that way, but I'm not sure there's absolute clarity on this issue of what defines Mātauranga Māori.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so there's a couple of things, because the lineal take you went from, let's say, Ptolemy, Galileo, Kepler, Newton, on to Einstein.
Mm-hmm.
You can see a lineal progression there. The thing about the 19th century with Māori is you didn't have to go through that lineal progression, right? So as soon as contact's made, it's bang.
Yeah.
They don't have to go through that. So really, they went from, and our tribe in 1863, it's a really interesting manuscript. We have the manuscript because one of our tribal priests has in his manuscript the tribal traditions of the creation of the universe, right? Next door to it, in that manuscript, in 1863, he's discussing Johann Medley's theory that Alcyone is the center of the universe, and then the perihelion. And he's got also in that manuscript Eratosthenes' equation of the circumference of the Earth.
Right.
So it's really quite an interesting thing. What they've done in 1 century is they didn't have to go through that lineal jumping situation that the West went through. And what's interesting in that is that easily, 1863, our tribal priests are discussing Medley's theory of the universe and Alcyone being the center. Now, what we know from Johann Medley is that he was wrong, but they're discussing the idea, right? They're automatically aware, and the manuscript's quite clear, they've got Eratosthenes' equations and they're writing in Greek. So I think there's assumptions made on all of those things because they modernize pretty quickly in our tribe. They just adopt the technology.
So,
and I think the idea that we're stuck in a medieval static spiritual world is probably wrong.
Yeah, okay, I take your point. And perhaps, I haven't thought enough about how Mātauranga Māori has evolved since contact with European people. So in your view, or to your knowledge, at this stage, Mātauranga Māori is not, at least anymore, so much of a monistic structure. Is that what you're contending?
No, I think let's just treat this as a discussion to just explore it. Look, if you go to the United States, it's a fascinating place. And, I go to Montana quite often in the inland of the United States, and the United States is a really interesting country for the advancement of knowledge, but they're completely religious people.
Yeah.
They're completely committed to, and I think you have those problems within our world as well. People believe in a spiritual world, but their day-to-day lives are governed by technology that has nothing to do with that. And I think we're not that different at all. What I know from the tribe is that we adopted technology pretty quickly. We went through the whole, if you want to take that linear approach, where you've got polytheism, belief in nature and the whole thing. Then you get up to a singular. That's why I like medieval history. You do it all in the 19th century in New Zealand with Māori. then you believe in prophets, then you believe in a single God. The whole thing's going on here. Do you really believe in a lot of that stuff? It's I think we're the same as anyone else in the world. What is interesting with the tribe is, though, we're continually adopting new knowledge systems. But I did want to touch on a thing. I don't necessarily think Māori beliefs, when we talk about atua is translated pretty quickly in the Western world into gods.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's the case. Our Tangaroa is not an ethnic variation of Neptune.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to see Tangaroa, it's right in front of you. If you want to see Papatuanuku, the Earth Mother's right in front of you, right? And quite often when we've got some interesting manuscripts where we're describing taniwha. And the taniwha down here in our manuscripts are simply natural phenomena that are extraordinary, but they're natural phenomena nonetheless.
So do you mean that there's not necessarily a mythological connotation to Papatuanuku or Tangaroa?
I think when they looked at Tangaroa, whatever, it's right in front of there and they understand there's something about it. Because language is only going to take us so far on this, isn't it? You can't describe God. God's a word. That's all it is.
Yeah.
And you need to understand the mindset of these people at this time. There's something about nature. There's something about a rainbow. There's something about the oceans when it's at its worst, or the wind. And I think those are the atua. Going beyond that is just trying to define metaphor.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I thought was important to understand about traditional knowledge systems is it's still useful, but we need to be clear about a couple of things. If you take our knowledge system on eels, for example, we've got a taxonomy of 9 or 10 types of eels in the South Island. Now, the Western taxonomy, or the usual one we have, is there's a short fin, long fin, so there's only 2 types of eels, which is fine. It's not wrong. That's a better explanatory theory. But if you want to know about eels, where to get them, their taste, the time of the season, all those types of things that matters on the ground, then you're far better to use ours, because the size differs according to the environment. So our taxonomy on eels is really quite interesting, the same as our taxonomy on water. There's different types of water.
And is that depending on whether it's in a river or a lake or the ocean, that kind of taxonomy?
Well, yeah. And, these taxonomies are, I was going through the cladists, evolutionary epistemology that went through in the 1980s. And the cladists said there's no such thing as fish.
Mm-hmm.
Because in evolutionary terms, there is no such thing as fish.
There's a whole lot of species, some of which get called fish.
Yeah, well, because ultimately, if you're tracking the evolution, fish don't exist. But of course, we ate a fish last night.
Yeah.
And those types of things are interesting with knowledge.
So it sounds like you're saying that Mātauranga Māori, in this description of it, is fully compatible with science, just in the sense that, as you say, you can divide the eels up into short-finned and long-finned eels, right? And you can also divide them up in a way that sort of helps you on the ground in a pragmatic sense, like where do I find the biggest eels in this season? And that's not wrong either, right?
It's not wrong. It's not falsifiable,
Yeah.
Well, I guess in some ways. But, just let's keep in mind, Einstein superseded Newton.
Yes.
But in this world, we use Newton's theory.
Because it works very well at our scale, that's right. Yeah, and it's a lot simpler.
Because it works, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think to some extent, the tribal knowledge system that I know and grew up with is, it still works. I mean, some of the reactions I have against it, though, is when there's overstatements made, like we were down the Antarctica. It's just ridiculous.
Right.
So one of the claims that was made by one of the signatories of the listener letter, Elizabeth Rata, is that science aims at making universal laws, making universal statements about how things work, sort of in general. So would you accept that as maybe a difference between science and Mātauranga Māori? Because it sounds like with the eels, science is trying to say, in absolute terms, from a kind of eternal point of view, of these two types of eels. And Mātauranga Māori is saying, look, if you're on the South Island and you have to eat eels and you want to find out where they are, this is the knowledge that can help you.
You can kind of see it as a tension between knowledge which is intended to be universal, to apply, as it were, anywhere and always, and knowledge which is specific to a local area and perhaps more utilitarian in the sense that it's of benefit to the people who live there. Is that a valid distinction, perhaps?
Well, it's the more I get into this, the more I'm distrustful of positing Mātauranga Māori in any of this discussion, because on a term, I'm not sure that I accept the term Mātauranga Māori. What I accept is I understand the importance of local knowledge systems,
Yes.
So the taxonomy for this is really important if you want to live in this environment. Now, Rata's point is correct, but it's not as if the tribe would disagree. So, yeah, it's science is the advancement of a theory that has more universality because it explains more regularities.
So it raises the question to me about whether the real fight is not between science and Mātauranga Māori, but between science and the Ministry of Education's take on Mātauranga Māori when it seeks to embed it in the curriculum. Is that something you've looked into at all?
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. Yeah. We've got to remember the term Mātauranga Māori came out in about the 1980s.
Right.
And I remember that paper I wrote on the epistemology issues. So Māori is an epistemology, Mātauranga Māori is an epistemology, then grew legs. But on the ground, in the environment that I live in, it's useful for my purposes. That's it. But, Rata's idea of science being a universal explanation, H2O is a really good universal theory for water.
Yeah.
2 hydrogen, 2O bonded to oxygen. That's fine. But it doesn't really do much if you have to explain water qualities. And you have to know where the drinking water is, or you have to know, it doesn't help you about the explanation of a lake, river, waterbed, lagoons, those types of things. And, if you go to the United States, I remember having a debate with my son on the car once going through Montana, the difference between a creek and a river.
Yeah.
I still don't know the difference. And it's very cultural and very different depending where you're going over there. But that's the same, the Riviera and river. Yeah. And I always thought a river was the thing that went to the sea. But of course, the Mississippi and the rest of those things, they go into other big rivers. So it's a bit of an oddity.
One of the biggest rivers in Australia, in fact, probably the biggest, the Murray, actually doesn't flow out to sea because all the water's been taken out of it before it gets there. And in Australia, a creek is often has no water in it at all, unless it's been raining a lot. It's empty. So.
Yeah, and so there's all types of taxonomies for that. I guess your point though about the education department, I distrust the education system for a whole bunch of things. Teaching science, I know we have to teach history next year. It's coming up soon, and if you want to ruin history, give it to the teachers,
or give it to the Ministry of Education at any rate.
Yeah.
So actually, on the point of education, I was really interested in your article, "The Death of Knowledge," that you actually went into some detail about the teaching at traditional whare purakau. I hadn't heard that term before. I heard the term whare wananga, but anyway, these are traditional sort of Maori houses of learning.
That's our version.
And this is maybe one way of getting more into what Mātauranga Māori is, because traditionally that was kind of Maori traditional knowledge, right? So can you talk more about what happened at these institutions?
Our elders, they've had their life histories on and off those institutions, right? I guess when you're dealing with what we would call Mātauranga Māori in the South Island, a lot of it's to do with food gathering, which is what we call mahinga kai. And it's always at the front of our heads. Just an interesting phenomena. The best scientists from the tribe come from Bluff, Southland, easily. And the reason is they're always outside. You know, when they leave school, you don't go on the benefit. You go straight on a fishing boat and work. And you're in front with nature all the time. So those types of knowledge systems that they have down there and up here is something that you live with if you're on the environment. How it translates into education, it's a really hard thing to teach. I don't know, because it's a life thing you have to learn. But, you know, I'm not too, you know, farmers know this, fishermen. You know, a farmer will know when it's going to rain over the hill.
Yeah.
Fishermen, you know, with the rod, with trout, they know where to go. You just know by instinct where they will be. So that type of knowledge is accumulated. It's about precision, quantification, all of those things. But different cultures have them all around the world.
That's right. It's what you might call, I mean, the propensity for that is what David Geary, the evolutionary psychologist, I think called biologically primary knowledge, which is to say, obviously the specifics of it varies with culture and place, but the propensity to have it is a human universal. And what distinguishes it from the kind of knowledge, at any rate, that I think we ought to be teaching at school is that it's knowledge that is acquired through cultural interaction, through communities, not as opposed to things like science, which unless you live in a very rarefied community, you are not going to learn in that way. It needs to be taught directly by somebody who understands it deeply.
Yeah, and that's the challenge that I would see with the sciences taught in secondary schools and whatever, actually even. But, you know, good scientists back in, at least when I went to school, they took you out to the beach or to the rivers and you watched, learned, which is really what our fathers did with us when we went out food gathering with them. You can see cause and effect, know what you're looking for. Now, that's an early type of science, but it's actually a basic building block to science, just watching the clouds, watching the weather.
Observation and patterns across observations.
That's why I'm kind of reluctant at times to call it Mātauranga Māori. And the reason is, you know, when the whalers came here and the sealers, they brought a new type of technology, but it added to it. So I'm reluctant to get into this, which is really where this discussion came to, and which is where I guess my views are going now. The idea of Western knowledge and modern knowledge and as Indigenous things, because when you study the tribe, we don't make the distinction. We adapt pretty quickly.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting take on it, because it you know, in some sense it must be right, in the sense that we've all been brought up in a world in which technology is a pervasive thing, and also the systems of knowledge that came from Europe to this country starting 200 years ago or so, it affects everybody's lives and everybody's thinking. So whatever ways of thinking Māori had before that have clearly changed, and it's hard to think how you would escape that, even if you wanted to.
Well, yeah.
Well, in the end, all that type of stuff goes into a cultural filter, whether it's us or... That's why I love going to the United States. I just can see the cultural filter more easily. And, I mean, we'll take things, put them through the cultural filter, but I think the Westernization argument is really interesting. You take this knowledge, you become Western. I think our take on it in the tribe is we take new knowledge because it allows us and I've heard this argument came from silence. It allows us to be more of who we are, and it allows us to be more of who we want to be. I don't think it necessarily makes us Western if we're clear about this.
Right. So that comes across very clearly in your article, The Death of Knowledge, where you say, basically, you seem to be advocating this view that Ngāi Tahu just needs to change and to open itself to different forms of knowledge. You say, colonization need not be viewed as a negative experience if we accept that change happens. And the last sentence of that article says, if we in Ngāi Tahu do not actively engage with the rest of the world, we will become an artifact.
Yep.
So,
which is how the Western world sees us.
Yeah.
Right.
I totally see what you mean. It's like, do you want this to be a museum piece or do you want it to be a living culture? Is that kind of capturing it?
Yeah, I mean, the thing about it's part of my grumpiness is this idea of colonization. You need to know how colonization happened. You need to know it from two ends, how Māori engaged, but you also need to know the Western systems of colonization and the Western mindset, what drives them, which is why I think you really need to know Western history. Mm-hmm. You need to know the Westminster system because that's the political structure that evolved. But the same plays out in the issues of knowledge systems because ultimately it happened. But if you're going to adapt and move quickly, that's where your head needs to be. Because the worst place you can be is, you see it kind of with British history where they talk about the great British Empire of the past. And the empire was great, but that's not where they are now. And the last thing you need are people. Everyone needs to appreciate their ancestors, but, history for me, I think Peter Munns, it's the teacher of life. And you better know the mistakes because you can't make them next time.
Right.
So I
don't see history as being about the truth and reality necessarily, in as much as about magister vitae.
Right. That's interesting. So just picking up what you said a little bit earlier there about sort of, I guess, adapting to change and being open to new ideas. I like this phrase you have in your article, mirror knowledge. You talk about mirror knowledge. So really knowledge that's sort of inwardly directed, and how that has its limitations. And I'm really pleased as a classicist that you actually quote Xenophanes of Colophon, this fragment of an early Greek philosopher, where he says, if horses and cattle had gods, their gods would look like horses and cattle. And the idea there is just that we all have this tendency to kind of look at the outward world and just see ourselves reflected in it, right? But you're trying to encourage, I guess, everybody, also Maori, to sort of be open to the outside. Is that right?
Yeah, which is why I like that idea of Nietzsche being in a valley of the past and the mountains are surrounding you like the past. The thing about our knowledge is just down the road, there's trees around here. If you're in the South Island, those Southern Alps are ancestors. I actually have the genealogies for those Southern Alps, okay? So you're looking at your ancestors. You're really looking at yourself. When I go down the road, I know where the time I wrote that article, I get up in the morning, I've got the owls hooting up on the roof, so I know who they are. There's a couple of trees next to the house that were ancestors. You go past the cemetery, you go past the rivers, and I live on a reserve. All of your ancestors there. If you just stay there, all you see are your ancestors, and all you see in the end is yourself. And teaching, what I was concerned about is teaching traditions of knowledge, and you get obsessed with your own self-importance. Mm-hmm. And, the reason why I've always loved history is I get our history. It's just self-evident where I live. But, if you want to know about Western politics, Tudor Constitution is a good place to start. But even oh God, my head's gone.
Athens?
Charlemagne.
Oh, Charlemagne. Okay.
And the politics of Charlemagne, Elizabethan history on the Tudor Constitution. It's all important. Yeah. Because you can see the growth of the Western mind there.
Yeah, well, and if you talk about the British Isles and England in particular, I think the evolution of their political institutions from Magna Carta on is, they ended up with really robust institutions, but it was a gradual evolution rather than ever being, well, they had their revolution, of course, in the 17th century, but it was fairly short-lived, and then they were back to monarchy again. And through this process, they developed an incredible robustness that I think those countries that had revolutions, we can think of the French Revolution, even more seriously the Russian Revolution in the early 20th century, they ended less well, shall we say. So there's something to be said for that evolutionary development of institutions rather than the kind of sudden sweeping away of the old and replacement.
Well, it's a phenomenon of this country. So the constitutional debate at the moment, everyone wants a constitution to mimic the United States Constitution. In my view, it's probably a bad thing to do. Because what's really interesting is the evolution of the Westminster system, and it's gradual, it's slow, but there's a point to it. And really, it's all about the balance of power, isn't it? And how you manage power, which is really what Western history is about. So I always found it interesting. After we removed the upper house, you had the Watersiders strike.
Yeah.
Then you had Holyoake get away with his Kinloch experiment. I just wonder whether any of that would have happened if we'd kept an upper house.
Well, some people argue, though, that the British and Commonwealth tradition, in Canada and New Zealand, is really more focused on the sovereignty of Parliament. So in some ways it's less balanced than the U.S. Constitution, because the U.S. Constitution says, there's the sort of democratic element of the Congress, but there's also the balancing elements of the President and the Supreme Court, which are sort of less democratic, or Supreme Court is appointed rather than elected.
And I guess that is important. The sovereignty of Parliament is always a question for us, which is why I like the upper house idea, which is what we got removed. But the point isn't the Constitution, is it? The point is the balancing of power and how you move through that.
Yeah, and certainly Commonwealth, the British system and Commonwealth systems in general, including New Zealand, they do have some checks and balances. But maybe we should have more.
One thing that occurs to me about the American Constitution as well is that it was written in its time, by which I mean that it reflected the values of the people who wrote it, who were steeped in a culture that was reflective of those values. If you just try to impose something that isn't steeped in the values of the time, then it won't really work. And one could argue that the American Constitution has lost some of its force over time because the value base that informed it in the first place has moved on or changed.
So that's where New Zealand needs to posit itself in this whole debate about power and how it's managed and the political issues going on with Māori, because those are the fundamental questions. The constitutional issue is a subset of that, where the real questions are, which is where I think we should be engaging. But that's where history is important. You know how things evolved. Sorry, we're right off track now with Martin.
No, that's fine, actually. No, I was actually going to ask you a follow-up because it's so interesting, because I know that some people think that in order to have a democracy, you also need to have a sense of the demos, right? The people, who the people are, and you need to have a sense of sort of national unity that underpins this, because otherwise, why should I accept that these people outvoted me and go along with their decisions if I don't really identify with them? And I know that the debate about Maori and co-governance is getting very heated, but I think there is a reasonable argument that we don't want to split up New Zealanders too much, right? On the other hand, I totally see that if you're from a particular ethnic background or local background and you're Maori and you have an iwi, that's something very precious that you want to keep hold of. So I wonder, how do we balance these two things of, connecting with our local traditions, but also seeing ourselves as part of a greater whole?
Oh, look, and that's sometimes where I have concerns about political statements coming out, and then you got to figure out what the hell's going on. And co-governance is one of them, but there's a couple of things you need to frame the debate around with co-governance, whatever the language you use. The truth is, in 98, when the tribe settled its claim, the Crown confirmed we have rangatiratanga, and it's explicit, which means really the right of self-government. The tribe will move there. you've got other settlements right throughout the country that says the same thing. So it's there. Just put it there, okay? The next issue that's going on is if you go through New Zealand's history, from the founding of the country, there's always been room for self-government by Māori. So iwi don't see their rights as being an ethnic race issue. It's clearly stated in the treaty and the subset land purchases agreements reached with the settler government at the time. So there's lots of examples where tribes do have the right to self-government. And when you read that early stuff by Ned Fletcher and Alan Ward, the rest of them, early premiers are saying there's no reason why Māori can't have the right to self-government, because if you look at British parliamentary democracy, you've got those bailiwicks, you've got different examples with the Irish, the Scottish, the Welsh, where they do have variations of self-government. And as they said, the British Empire had no problems as long as there's sovereignty to the Queen. The idea of different types of government can work, but it's that balancing act that you've got to manage. Because what you don't really want in this country is, in legislative terms, tribes can actually go off and do what they want. The mechanisms are there. But you want people to cooperate, because the alternative is what happened in my village in 1968, which is when I was a child. The power culture, which was the county council, simply said you can't build here anymore.
Right. Yeah.
Okay? Now, they did that because the county council were farmers. What did farmers want? More land. So the justification they had for removing the people from our village is they said the land in Tuahiwi, we can get 40 cents a bale of hay on a 5-acre paddock.
Yeah.
Right. This year we get 1,100 bales of hay, but next year we can get, 14-acre paddock. Next year we can get a 1,700 to 1,900 bales of hay. So what they did is they prohibited our people from building here. So my father, 12 in the family, one family were allowed to live in the pa, the rest had to move into the city. My mother, 10 in her family, 2 lived in the pa, 8 had to go in the city. So if you start counting up the costs of housing, the social trauma that occurred, it's, long story short, we'll never trust local government on those things.
Yeah, right. And it seems to me that there's a difference here, which this example highlights, between what you said before about the Scottish and the Welsh having a degree of self-government, and the idea that iwi can have self-government in this country, which is that Scotland and Wales are geographically separate from England, whereas what you were talking about is an overlap of peoples on the same land. So you had the local hapu with their interests, and you had the local council who were making rules over a geographical area that hapu belonged to, and those came into conflict. So how does one how does one deal with the idea of self-government on the same lot of land? If you've got 2 jurisdictions, how do you resolve competition between them?
Yeah, it's really interesting. When our village had self-government, the economy was going really well. Governor Gray said in, I think, 58 or something, 63, can't remember. He said the Māoris aren't really poor, which I didn't. I took the grain of salt. Then I found out he was talking about our village here. And that was his word. The Māoris aren't really poor.
Mm-hmm.
When I got into the economics of this, he was quite right. Right. The economy in the village is doing really well. It's flourishing. The trade's all over the place because they have their own jurisdiction and authority here. Now, that can't play out today because the nature of our world is just so different from back then. You know, you can't separate, it would be the wrong thing, but I think the challenge for us is where we manage the levers of power for our development. Now, clearly, 68 and the examples that went on there, it was just really local rule corruption against our people.
Yeah.
And it's not to say it doesn't still happen. I find what happened with Holyoke and Kinloch fascinating.
Can you just explain that? Because just maybe some listeners aren't familiar with what happened. I'm not actually. So.
Oh, it's a really interesting case study. Holyoke was, I think, the Minister of Land. He was a minister at that time, and he'd purchased rural land just around Taupo. But he was minister. But a lot of government departments were used, to assess the validity, the soil type and what's going on there. Māori land was purchased in a way that probably wasn't valid. And but they got away with it at the time because it wasn't strict. And then the highway went through. Well, all of a sudden, there's a detour from the main highway going through the North Island to Kinloch. So infrastructure got there pretty quick, right. And the whole area opened. Okay.
Yeah.
So, and then Holyoke becomes Prime Minister, then the Governor General. It's an interesting case study on what goes on in local politics in New Zealand. But I think this just takes negotiation on where things are reasonable. So in this village, we've been prohibited from building houses since 1968 through to 2014. There's no justification for it other than local self-interest by the farming community. But no one's covered. I mean, if you think those 10 families from my father's side that had to go into the city, they didn't have the money to build houses because in 67, they just would have built a house on the land. That's it. And then the 8 from mum's family that went into the city, and you just see the cultural dislocation, everything that happened.
Yeah, it occurs to me that kind of urbanisation was a massive driver of disenfranchisement of Māori from their kind of cultural and community backgrounds, that really sustaining, even though there was much more what we might call overt racism in the early 20th century than the late 20th century. In some ways, Māori were worse off as a result of that dislocation.
Yeah, and that's pretty much the game that's going on. And I think it's just a negotiation of the levers on how I think everyone has to be compelled to cooperate. There are clear reasons from treaty settlements and in previous legislation where Māori do have a right to have a say of their assets. I saw that statement by Seymour from the ACT Party, which was an interesting one. Maybe the best thing they could have done, he said, was to remove the restrictions on Māori land. Just get out of it. So if you go through Māori land today, it's the most regulated, regulated asset. My aunt had to build a house down the road. I think it took us 6 years to get it. And then the judge from the Māori Land Court had to come out and assess and give permission. And I was thinking, nowhere in the world do you guys have to get a judge to visit the piece of land to give permission for Māori to build on it.
Yeah.
It's dead capital, and it's dead capital from overregulation.
Very interesting. Yeah, I wonder if I could actually... Sorry?
Yeah.
I wonder if I could actually change tack again and bring us back towards the Mātauranga Māori stuff. But actually, in particular, what I want to do is pick up this topic that you touched on earlier a few times, which is this theory that's been put out that really, I guess, Polynesians sighted Antarctica or were sailing in Antarctic waters in the 7th century AD, I think, is the claim. And this was put out in an article that we'll add the link to in below the video or below the podcast. But it's called A Short Scan of Maori Journeys to Antarctica by Priscilla Wahi and others. It's published in the Journal of the Royal Society of New Zealand. And you and Athol Anderson and other colleagues wrote a response on the improbability of pre-European Polynesian voyages to Antarctica. And there's actually a good summary in an article in The Listener, which we'll also link to. But the way I understand it is that the claim in the original article is that there were voyages by a figure called Hui Te Rangiora in his vessel, I guess, a double canoe. And his vessel was called Te Iwi o Atea, and this was likely in the 7th century AD, so before the Polynesians even came to New Zealand and became the Maori. And then there was a name, Te Tai Uku a Pia, which was used for the sea, apparently, and the claim is that this means like pia or arrowroot, which when scraped looks like snow. So the argument is, this all comes from, I think, 19th century oral histories, that you can find in these oral histories these stories about this voyager, and in these stories the sea is referred to as like a plant that is white when you scrape it, and therefore they must have seen Antarctica. So yeah, is that the right claim? And yeah, what do you think about this claim?
It's nonsense. Just nonsense. I mean, I don't know what to say. We went through the original translation. Māori would say to hoka tai a pia, to pia, tai hoka a pia. It just means foam on the ocean. That's it. It's from a manuscript in the Cook Islands, Rarotonga, from a person back there. The canoe or the waka was made of human bones. So it's gone straight to the realm of myth. That's what it is. It's not a travel log of what happened. And what's happened is a group have used that passage and text, which is really a series of metaphor, which they've converted into facts to suit themselves.
I guess this comes back a little bit to the contention that I made vis-a-vis Mātauranga Māori and science earlier on. Only here it's really oral histories and perhaps mythology in relation to...
So the difference is I wouldn't call that Mātauranga Māori.
Right, sure. So
I would call that Carlos Castaneda.
Sorry, say that again, please.
I would call that Carlos Castaneda.
Okay, right, yeah. A bit of psychedelic drugs involved, perhaps.
Oh, it's just nonsense. And it's annoying because it damages what we would see as valid knowledge systems within the tribe, because we do have valid observations and practices that are from a long experience. We know with some things precision and detail.
Yeah.
We know the regularities that are going to occur, but that's not Mātauranga Māori.
Okay.
That's just speculation-based nonsense built on stilts.
Yeah. And the point you raised about it being damaging, I think is a really good one, and something that concerned me when I was looking at the new science standards for NCEA that the Ministry for Education were developing and claiming to infuse them with Mātauranga Māori. And it seemed to me that not only was it damaging to science, but also damaging to Māori understandings and traditions, because it exposed them to potential ridicule. So I'll give you an example. There was a standard about microbiology that had reference to the use of microorganisms in food production, fermentation and the like. And the claim in this standard, which was a biology standard, was that if you said correct karakia, for international listeners that's prayers essentially, over the fermenting product, then it would have improved the fermentation process. And it just occurred to me that this was a way of, they'd set out with these intentions of fusing these knowledge systems that didn't seem to fit very well together to me, in a way that just made a mockery of them.
So I'll just give a clear view on this. Oh my God. So we've got a lot of experience on fermentation.
Yeah.
Believe me, I know what we're doing when we're dealing with fermentation within the tribe.
Yeah.
We've got a lot of words. It's really quite an interesting thing. And we've got practical knowledge. It's really interesting when you go on our islands. People have steel benches. We got rid of them pretty quickly. And we prefer wooden benches, which we found cleaner because we can salt them. And we just found steel benches weren't the most hygienic things to have. Anyway, look, we have all that, and that's where Mātauranga Māori, and my big concern by people who don't know, because if you knew about fermentation issues, you'd know karakia aren't the most important thing. It doesn't rest or hang on that. And the problem with Mātauranga Māori is it could be, if it's done wrong, where the esoteric is disembodied from the ground. Mm-hmm. So what you'll get is disembodied knowledge, where there's an overemphasis on esoteric, but there's no connection to daily lives and what you do. Because like I said, the tribe is really well versed in fermentation.
Yep.
So it sounds like there might be room here for some kind of compromise where in the New Zealand school system, you could have a unit on, say, fermentation, and you do the sort of general universal science of fermentation, and then there's a sort of add-on unit where you say, oh, you might be interested that Ngāi Tahu or some other Maori iwi has all of these customs around fermentation, and they've built them up through practical experience. And that, as we saw with the eels, the local knowledge doesn't contradict the universal knowledge, but it can be seen as a kind of an add-on, sort of interesting thing that you might learn as part of, developing a sense of being a New Zealander and being a New Zealand citizen.
Sure. The only thing I've got is quite often I find students learn best from add-ons. If you start with the actual activity. One of the things the tribe has are teddy pooks, which we let mutton birds ferment. But the interesting thing is, when I was younger, I used to work with a Welshman who used to put his pheasants up on the trees to ferment as well. And it's no different from ginger beer or blue cheese or anything else. There's just all those practical things, and we're just part of that. But hanging it on a karakia, no.
Well, it was just clear to me that the ministry were bending over backwards to, put square pegs in round holes, really.
Yeah, and the tribe has a lot of things that are interesting on local ground knowledge. I'm not sure what the term is, but we do things all the time. But, if you're in a rural country, if you're in a rural area, the farmers are no different. People out in the rural communities just know things.
Yes. Yeah, even if they have no theory for it, and you couldn't see how to test it, they have assimilated experience to an extent that they have an intuition, and the intuition is mostly right.
And a lot of trial and error goes on. If you go back to the mutton birders down south, and even up here, we've got different systems. Our mutton birds went into poha, then they went into tin buckets, plastic buckets. So I can actually see a lot of people going back to poha because it's organically good, right, and it actually looks clean.
Sorry, what are poha?
But poha are kelp bags that down south they open up, and we store food in them. It's an organic bubble wrap, because kelp is essentially bubble wrap, but it's organic.
And there's a lot of salt in it, which would help with preservation as well.
All of that. Yep. You got to know what salt to use.
Yeah.
But, that's no different from what farmers do in the sheds when they're doing home kills, all the rest of it. Yeah.
All right, we've got about 5 minutes left before we hit the hour, but I don't really know what your views on this topic are, but you mentioned it before we started that we might discuss it, and that's just academic freedom. So perhaps I should just ask, what are your concerns on that front?
You went on Marae to discuss an issue. Believe me, there's no safe space.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Doesn't exist. And you don't get up and speak unless you know your game and you're responsible. So it's fine. You want your academic, fine. But the thing on Marae, you're made accountable. And I guess the issue I have with academic freedom, and it's there, it should be there, but stick to the lanes. Because we know there's been research in New Zealand within the universities that are just nonsense, and where scholars have just gone outside of their brief and their expertise, and then they have an opinion. The tribe's more than once gone, one of the reasons for the Ngāi Tahu identity and legislation is we had a historian years ago simply make nonsense claims in his publications, and we wanted to sue. But of course, we couldn't sue because the tribe didn't exist as a legal identity. Well, we can sue now. Now, I think academic freedom's fine. Everyone needs to be held accountable, but everyone needs to be held accountable and stick to the lanes. And I think what's annoying the tribe sometimes are when experts in one field have an opinion in a field they know nothing about. But at the same time, we appreciate the need for criticism. But again, it's responsibility. I think the question is how to weigh up responsibility. I'll tell you an interesting thing. We did a survey of, and you have to be accountable to the community. So some of the interesting things we found with our public lectures in the university is when we went into the city, everyone engaged because people want to know, and they are fully engaged. When you have discrete little discussions that have impact and you're not accountable, that's the issue with our tribe. And to some extent, I do think the right of universities to be the critical conscience is important. But if people step out of their lanes into other areas, they need to be held to be accountable.
Well, I think
really on my eye.
Yeah, I know what you're saying there. I know what you're saying, especially when people say things they really don't know, when they really don't know what they're talking about, and that needs to be challenged. But I mean, what do you do with sort of interdisciplinary work? Because it strikes me that, for example, like my main field is classics, and I work on ancient Greek democracy, and I know about that. But I also think it's interesting for me to sort of talk about democracy in general. I can feed into that. Now, I try and be responsible. I try not to pretend I'm an expert in sort of modern New Zealand democracy, but I can kind of comment on modern New Zealand democracy in a restrained way by comparing it with the ancient Greeks, right? So surely that's the case with a lot of subjects, that there are these synergies which are actually quite profitable.
Yeah, and I agree. But you know as well as I do, there's the odd case that comes out. So years ago, there was a thesis in New Zealand about Holocaust denial. Now, there needed to be stringent regulations on that sort of stuff.
It seems to me, though, that much the same set of issues applies to academic freedom as to free speech more generally. And I would posit that the best way to deal with that kind of thing, rather than trying to censor it, would be just to marshal experts to correct the record.
Yeah, I wonder with the Holocaust thesis, I think that was at Canterbury, right? I mean, I haven't looked at it or read it, but it's sort of surprising to me that wasn't just shut down through the internal process of criticism and saying, where's your evidence?
Why the proposal got up in the first place is a good question.
So there was another one years ago where it was on tribal man in the Great Society, which was a fascinating thing because it took the lineal thing, and really the only evidence this particular scholar came to, which was very subjective, and he spoke about the people in this village as having wide trousers, they slouched too much, they didn't have the language still. Wide trousers, slouched too much, they didn't have the language, and they gambled. And that was his contribution to the bad scholarship. It was just poor scholarship, and someone needs to be accountable for it.
But isn't the
so fine? Pardon?
The right mechanism of accountability seems to me other scholars publishing rebuttals,
which I guess is what you did with the Antarctica case, right?
Quite.
Yeah. But there are times when I do worry about the academic community because they feed that nasty bubbling on the right and the left.
Yeah.
And scholarship is used, and you can see the scholars on either side, and they're feeding that simmering pot of nastiness that goes on both sides.
And that's because I agree with you, and I think it's because academia has lost the plot somewhat. It's become too politicized, and it's become too polarized in its approach, rather than taking a neutral and evidence-based stance and arguing the case on the basis of that evidence all too often now. And I see it rampant in my field of education. People argue based on the conclusions they'd like to draw and work backwards.
And I'm not going to argue with that. It's fairly self-evident. But as a classic scholar, you've got room to move, James.
Room to move in the sense that there are lots of subjects that I could go into. Or?
There's a lot to talk about. It'd be when you move into other areas that are clearly, if you started expressing tauranga Māori views.
Yeah. There are some subjects I couldn't go into. Like, of course, I can talk about maybe English literature. If I know about Homer and Virgil, I can talk about Milton. I can't talk about quantum physics, really. If I did, I would embarrass myself. But I mean, that's what I mean. Hopefully the accountability is, if I went on TV and said, hey, I actually discovered this new thing about quantum physics, what they should do is just bring on an actual expert in quantum physics who would ruthlessly expose my ignorance, right? Yeah. Yeah.
And look, that's where we are on debate within the university. I always thought Pride and Prejudice was a good start to all that, but no one's listening too hard. Jane Austen was a good critic of the Regency. And if you watch it, though, Darcy and Miss Elizabeth, they grow because the criticism is helpful.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. And that's the essence of good scholarly debate, isn't it?
So look, we really appreciate you coming on to share your local and particular knowledge, even if you might not want to call it Mātauranga Māori, but it's what we were saying at the end there. I mean, it's just so important to kind of bring the temperature down by talking to people with different particular knowledges and different views. So I think this has been a really good episode. So thanks.
Thank you most kindly.
Come on, say hello to Eric.